Let's dive right in. I'm going to share my screen. We'll just get it to be in slide fashion. Alrighty. Back. So 2 brand new portraits donated to the Historical Society this summer. And really one of the more interesting and fun weeks that I've had at the Society, maybe not a full week, maybe a few days, really diving in and trying to research and learn more about these portraits, because it became apparent right from the beginning that they probably really weren't who the donor thought they were. Linda Boltwood Dickinson very generously donated these 2 big, beautiful portraits, really good condition, to the Historical Society this August. She had called beforehand and said that she was going to bring us, if we wanted them, she was going to bring us a portrait set that had descended through her family of the Reverend Mace Shepard, who was the minister at the Congregational Church in Little Compton, and his wife, Deborah Haskins Shepard. And Mace was the minister in Little Compton from about 1787 until his death in 1821. So Linda had offered the portraits to the Congregational Church first, which is sort of a logical thing to do. And the church was hesitant to accept them because it is hard sometimes to be the steward of historic items. You know, can you really take care of them forever? Do you have the right environmental conditions for them? If they need conservation, do you have a budget to help take care of those problems? And that is something that a museum is much more likely to be able to do than a church. And so we actually had a few phone calls between ourselves and the church and Linda, and everyone in the end agreed that the Historical Society might be the better home for these portraits, knowing that we had a really great relationship with the church, and if they ever wanted to borrow them, as long as they were going to be displayed in a safe place, you know, we would gladly lend them. So Reverend Rebecca and I met with Linda and her friend Cam, who is hosting her in New England, because Linda is from the Midwest, and I'm sorry, but I can't remember exactly where she's from. And we showed Linda the church. We showed her the cemetery where the Reverend is buried, where his son, John Haskins Shepard, is buried. And meanwhile, the portraits are wrapped up in her car, so we hadn't seen them yet. We went to the Historical Society, brought the portraits in and unwrapped them. And I'll have to say, I was very excited to have portraits of Reverend Shepard and his wife, because they are 18th century people. You know, they lived over that change of the century, but the potential of having an 18th century Little Compton portrait was really exciting. The possibility of having a portrait of one of our ministers and his wife, really exciting, sort of key historical figures. And we certainly didn't have anything like that in the collection. As they unwrapped the portraits, I got my first hint that maybe it was going to be a little more complicated than, you know, simply believing and agreeing that these were portraits of the Reverend and his wife. Under no circumstances would I pretend to be an expert on portraits. You know, when you work at a small place like the Historical Society, you tend to become a jack of all trades and a master of none. So I certainly don't feel like a portrait expert, but coincidentally, we had the Women's History exhibit up at this moment in time, which had an awful lot of portraits on display. And we had worked with a portrait expert, Nancy Grinnell, earlier in the year, looking at many Little Compton portraits, the ones that we owned as a museum, ones that community members lent us for this portrait study. So I had just spent a long time looking at local portraits, and these two portraits did not look time period appropriate for Reverend Shepard and Deborah. For the Reverend and Deborah to be about as old as these people, did the slideshow just disappear?
We still see it on our side, but it hasn't advanced from the gift from Linda, if you intended it to.
No, okay, that's fine. I'm still on that page.
Okay.
This portrait would have had to been done about 1800 for the ages of the folks to be right. And even with just the little bit that I know, this didn't look like a late 18th century portrait. Here are a couple of late 18th century portraits. The first one is a Little Compton portrait. It belongs to Nancy Clark. It's descended through her family. And Nancy Grinnell told us that this is probably a 1790 or so portrait done in the Gilbert Stuart style. And the other one is Benjamin Franklin, also done about 1790. And the key thing with these late 18th century portraits is that people are wearing colors. I'm trying to actually, Jen, there's someone waiting to come in. If you could let them in. When I try to let them in, it advances the slides. So our donated portraits, they're wearing black, a little different style of clothing, and they look much more at home among this grouping of portraits, which is our 19th century portrait collection. Everyone in black. And a subset of these portraits that we can date to the mid-19th century, you can see that the women's clothing is even more similar, especially the collars are sort of quite similar. So at first glance, I think I'm looking at mid-19th century portraits, not something that could be the Reverend and his wife. But the donor, Linda, believes it to be true. That was the family story forever, that these were portraits of the Reverend Mace Shepard from Little Compton and his wife. And she got that information from her aunt, who is a very careful family historian. Linda said her aunt was always right, so it must be true. And I personally, and the Historical Society in general, take family histories and family stories very seriously. It's definitely not something we want to dismiss out of hand or without careful research. Because even if after a whole bunch of research, we can figure out what might not be accurate in a family story, there almost always is a thread of truth running through that family story that is helpful when you're trying to understand the whole picture. So we gathered as much information from Linda as we possibly could while she was with us. And one thing that was really helpful is on the back of the portraits, handwritten in pencil, Linda's stepmother, who had the portraits mounted on board in around 1950, wrote O. Bullard on the back of both of those portraits. And we all presumed, Linda and I presumed, that was the painter of the portrait. And for 19th century portraits, it's actually really unusual to know who the painter could be. So this was a really good clue. So Linda left and I started doing as much internet research as I could to find out more about the portraits, and especially to start with our clue regarding O. Bullard. And that turned out to be very fruitful and quite helpful. This set of family portraits appeared almost immediately online, identified as the work of Otis A. Bullard. And this happens to be Emily Dickinson's family from Amherst, Massachusetts. Emily is the oldest girl in the portrait of the children. And the adults are her parents, Edward, and actually I believe the mom's name is Emily as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone knows that bit of information. So Otis Bullard was a sign painter's apprentice who started doing portraiture in 1838, and in 1840, he was in Amherst painting portraits. So I think he progressed really beautifully from sign painting to painting portraits of this quality in just a matter of a few years. But this was really because our portraits look so much like these adult portraits, and because O. Bullard was written on the back of our portrait, I became very comfortable accepting that these were Otis A. Bullard portraits, probably also painted around 1840. And Amherst made all kinds of sense, because when the Reverend Shepard died in Little Compton at age 62 in 1821, Deborah, his wife, moved the family of adult children, almost adult children, to Amherst, where two of her sons attended Amherst College, and they built a new family home. So let me go back 1 second. So because we know that O. Bullard didn't start painting until 17 years after Mace Shepard's death, we could really comfortably rule out the portrait sitters being Mace Shepard and Deborah Haskins Shepard, his wife. It was much more likely, since they had descended through the family, that it was a younger generation of the family. Maybe the next generation, one of the Shepard's 9 children. And some of those 9 children were pretty easy to rule out. John Haskins Shepard died as a young man, teenager in Little Compton. He's buried here. So he didn't go to Amherst, couldn't possibly have been painted. Another child named Thomas, we do not have a death date for him, but he is no longer alive in 1821. He predeceased his father. There was another son named Ralph, who had graduated from Brown University and then had started Brown University and then moved with his mom and his brothers and sisters to Amherst to attend Amherst. He also died in 1821, the same year as his father. So Deborah's going through a really tragic period of time in her life. And another person that's, fairly easy to rule out was Mary. Mary Shepard was single. She never married. And since we're dealing with a portrait pair, it would be very unlikely that she would be the woman in the portrait. So now we have fewer people to choose from. And one of the Shepard children who became quite successful, and again, it was pretty easy to find things about him on the internet and to find images of him, was Charles Upham Shepard. So Charles Shepard graduated from Amherst as a chemist, and he became a professor of chemistry at Amherst, and then also got his medical degree. And so at some point he moved to South Carolina and was on the medical faculty at the University of South Carolina in Charleston. So we ruled out Charles Upham Shepard just because he really doesn't look like the man in the portrait. He looks really quite different. And so we can decide that it's not Charles. That left one more son who is really quite prominent, the Reverend George Champlin Shepard. And for quite a long time, for a couple of days, I really was thinking that maybe our donated portraits were actually a second set of portraits, the man in the set being George. So when Linda was with us visiting, they told us that her family, not in her possession, but in the wider family, that there were other family portraits as well. And these portraits appeared online when I was doing searches for the family. So this is a portrait set that was owned by Linda's family members in Amherst. They don't, and they are believed to be the Reverend George Champlin Shepard and his wife, Sally Shepard. They were donated to the Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst, where they hung for many years, and then became in really poor, sort of unstable, dangerous conditions, dangerous for the portraits. The church sold them to Skinner's auction house. Skinner, in turn, sold them to Nathan Liverant Antiques of Colchester, Connecticut, who invested quite a bit in restoring the portraits, and then gave Grace Episcopal Church a high quality image of the portraits so they could have reproductions done. So if you go to Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst today, you'll see these portraits hanging there, but they're high quality reproductions, not the originals. The originals are quite expensive, and they're still for sale at the Nathan Liverant Antique Store in Colchester, Connecticut. Their staff person, whose name is Kevin Tulimieri, and I pronounced that terribly, so I apologize if he ever watches the tape. I do apologize. Did a fantastic job researching these portraits. He has asked me not to give too much detail away because he thinks he's going to publish his work, but he attributes the portraits to Reuben Rowley of Hebron, Connecticut. He and the Reverend George Champlin Shepard were friends. He's convinced me that that's who the artist is. But what was really important for us is, what do these portraits tell us about the portraits that were donated to us? These were done in 1826, so they're about 20 years older than the portraits we have. George graduated from Divinity College around that time. Made perfect sense for him to have his portrait done around 1826. And very normal to assume that it's his wife. But in looking at these portraits, I see a very young man, and George would have been 25 in this picture. And I see a woman who looks quite a bit older than 25. So off the bat, I'm not totally convinced that it's a husband and wife. And I wonder if maybe it's a husband, it's a son and his mother. And the reason why I'm thinking maybe this is a portrait of Deborah Haskins Shepard, Mass Shepard's wife, is because one of the family stories that Linda was told was that the family owned a portrait of Deborah in her old age. So the family may have had two portraits of Deborah. And perhaps this is one. So we did a lot of research on George, and we did a lot of research on Sally to see what we could figure out. I enlisted help in order to do this, because when I started researching Sally, getting an accurate year of birth for her was next to impossible. You could get an inferred year of birth from her death record, but nothing really made sense. Nothing added up. So I used the help of Kevin Tulimieri from the antique store. I enlisted my board member, Juanita Goulart, who's a retired research librarian, an excellent researcher. She really went to work trying to find the date of Sally's birth. And also a friend of mine, the state archaeologist from Massachusetts, Ed Bell, who's an extraordinary researcher regarding court documents. He found something very interesting for us that we'll talk about in just a minute. So this is one of the reasons why I thought what we might have been given was a second portrait of Charles 15, 20 years later. And I'll just speak for myself. When I look at these portraits side by side, I see a resemblance. I think it could be the same man, 15 years apart, done by two very different artists with very different styles. So I could be convinced that it was two portraits of George Champlin Shepard, an Episcopal minister. And I found that interesting. His dad had been a Congregationalist, but he became Episcopal. But it didn't work so well when you tried to compare the women, because the woman's portrait was clearly so much older. The first portrait, the folk style portrait, the woman in it is clearly so much older than the woman's portrait that had been donated to us. And so again, this made me think, well, maybe it's not his wife, maybe it's his mother in the 1826 portrait and his wife in the 1840 portrait. Portrait sets of sons and mothers are really pretty uncommon. So that was one strike against that theory. And then we'll talk about Sally's age in just a moment. The two women do resemble each other. George married his first cousin. So George married his mother's niece. So if we are looking at aunt and niece here, George's mother and the niece that her son married, it's not too surprising that there might be a family resemblance among these women. And here is the result of the research that Juanita confirmed or found and shared with us. Sally was George's first cousin. Sally probably was 18 years older than George when they married. He was 25 when they married. She was 43. All throughout her life, Sally did a really good job of hiding her age. She fibbed about her age. You cannot find her age on her gravestone. She does not appear in censuses. Juanita figured out that she probably was in Europe during many of the censuses, and so just never appears in them. I could not, no, none of us could find a birth certificate for her. And again, the only accurate sign of her age was her death certificate that gave her an inferred birth year, making her 18 years older than her husband, and telling us that she died of old age at the age of 84. When she went to Europe, she had to tell the officials, the government officials, how old she was. She always made herself 8 years older than her husband instead of 18 years older than her husband when she traveled to Europe. We also learned Sally was fabulously wealthy. She was the only child of a doctor in Boston. She inherited his entire estate and lived a very comfortable life, hence the European trips later in life. When they married, Sally had an 11-page prenuptial agreement drawn up that they signed immediately before their wedding. At this time, when a woman married, all of her belongings, all of her assets instantly became her husband's. Sally prevented that from happening by having her attorneys draw up this agreement. And so she sort of outwitted, or not just sort of, she truly outwitted the law of coverture, which is where a husband sort of covers his wife and assumes all of her belongings, all of her wealth when they're married. So women at this time gave up a lot of independence when they married because their husbands would now control all of their wealth. Sally prevented that from happening. She maintained total control of her wealth until her death because of this prenuptial agreement. And the prenuptial agreement did make allowances in case they had children. She was 43 when she married. They never did have children. And toward the very end of her life, she did soften the agreement a little bit so that George had a little bit more independence and a little bit more money of his own toward the end of her life. I think it's safe to say that we're looking at a marriage of convenience. And we can think about all the reasons why a couple in the 1800s might have a marriage of convenience. One of the most likely is that one or both of them were homosexual and not interested in a typical marriage of the time, but desperately in need of some sort of protection from society that this marriage would have given them. That is one possibility. We cannot prove it. We shouldn't assume that that's the truth, but I think we just need to be open to that as a possibility. Another possibility is that George was a gold digger and married his cousin because he wanted her money. He lived a fantastic life, far above the means of a normal Episcopalian minister, with these elaborate European trips, with the ability to work part-time, sometimes not work at all. He had a very good life because of Sally's money. And a third possibility is maybe they were crazy in love with each other. As unlikely as that may seem to us, we're taught not to marry our first cousins. It's very unusual even today for a woman to be 18 years older than her husband. But maybe it was a love match and the heart wants what the heart wants. But I have to say, if I was crazy in love, I don't think I would have my attorneys draft an 11-page prenuptial agreement. So I think marriage of convenience is a safe bet in this circumstance. The internet also showed us that there were other portraits back in history, not in possession of Linda's ancestors, but from the Haskins side of the family. So John and Hannah Haskins had their portraits done in the 1700s by Joseph Badger of Boston. John Haskins was a cooper, a ship captain, and a distiller in Boston, and accumulated quite a bit of wealth. So the Haskins were a very affluent, very well-educated, elite family in Boston. So that we have 3 portraits now of women from the same family. Hannah, the grandmother, is the first. Then the woman in the middle, who, in my mind, I'm trying to decide if this is her daughter, Deborah, or her granddaughter, Sally. And then we have our third portrait, the woman donated to us, certainly a family member. We can see the family resemblance, but we still haven't quite figured out who she might be. In the end, with all the help from Juanita and all the help from Ed Bell, who found the 11-page marriage contract for us, and Kevin's research, and the 18-year age difference between George and Sally, I agreed that that portrait pair, the folk-style portrait pair, probably really was George and Sally. And Kevin at the antique store assures me that in person, the portrait is a little more flattering. It doesn't show age quite as much. And what he thinks I'm seeing online is that there is a blue-gray canvas for the portrait that tends to age the woman in the portrait. Okay. So if the portraits donated to us are not the Shepard children that we've talked about already, especially not the Reverend George Champlin Shepard, who I had really settled on for a while, who could they be? And as I was driving to work one day, I was going right by Taylor's Lane, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what about the Boltmans? Maybe it's the Boltmans. And so we started to research that path, and that proved to be much more fruitful for us. One of the key pieces of information, so who are the Boltmans? The Shepard's daughter, Franny, married Lucius Boltman in 1824. Franny was 17, Fanny was 17. Lucius was about 15 years older. The key little bit of information here that I knew at the time was that Lucius Boltman was the law partner of Edward Dickinson. And if you compare the Dickinson portraits by Bullard that were done in 1840 to our donated portraits, the similarities are just striking. Okay, it's almost as though we don't have portrait pairs anymore. It's like we have a portrait quartet. So these two couples, the husband working together every day in the law office, very likely, and I would say almost certainly, hired the same painter around the same time to do very similar portraits. The backgrounds are similar, clothing styles are similar, especially the women's collars are similar. And the thing that really sort of hit home for me, the frames are identical. Right? So the idea that these are the Boltmans is really starting to take shape for me. Lucius Boltwood, and Fanny Haskins Shepard Boltwood. So we started to look for photographs of Lucius and Fanny that might help confirm this, because both of them lived certainly well long enough into the 19th century for there to be photographs of them. Photographs were kind of hard to find. They didn't pop up easily online, but Linda's friend Cam Auburn was able to help us out. Camilla Auburn, has recently purchased a Boltwood home, not in Amherst, Massachusetts, but in Goshen, Massachusetts. Many of the items from the Boltwoods' home in Amherst were inherited by their descendants who lived in what was called the Williams Boltwood home in Goshen. And that house was so well preserved and so filled with antiques that the folks in Goshen are actually trying to turn it into a house museum right now. That is where all the other Boltwood portraits are now. They are unfortunately wrapped up and in storage, so we can't see them. But there are some loose photographs and there are some photo albums, and Cam has been very generous about sharing images with us. So she was able to send us portraits of Lucius Boltwood and Fanny Boltwood, taken about 20 years after the portraits were painted. Fanny would have been 33 in 1840 when the portrait was painted, and I think the portrait is very convincingly of a 33-year-old woman. Lucius was 15 years older, which makes him 48 years old. And again, I think the portrait of a 48-year-old man, that's pretty convincing. The photographs we see were done when Lucius was 71 years old, and Fanny would have been 15 years younger than that. And I think there's a strong enough resemblance there that the photographs started to confirm for me that these really were portraits of Lucius and Fanny Boltwood. And there was more evidence that helped us believe that even more. We found more photographs of Fanny over time. And you know what? I did write Franny on the slide. There's no R, it's Fanny. So I'll correct that in my notes. And you can see in the family album, they've got her identified correctly as Fanny. Okay. These two pictures taken the same day because she has the same ornament in her hair. This photograph appeared in a book that talked about the Boltwood family that I'll read from in just a little bit, because it gives us a wonderful description of who Fanny was as a person. And then the photograph of her as an older person who was taken from a Boltwood album that Cam sent to us online. So Lucius Boltwood. So I am going to read just one paragraph from a book called Around the Green. And it is a reminiscence of old Amherst, Massachusetts, written in the 1930s. And it's written by a woman whose name we'll see in just a little bit, who as a young girl walked through the Boltwood home, had conversations with Mrs. Boltwood, remembered her, and describes her in a way that I thought was really interesting. Mrs. Boltwood was one of the most entertaining women in Amherst. She was a fluent and fascinating talker. When you chanced to meet her on the street, she would greet you with a cordial smile and plunge immediately into conversation. She knew all about your family, and incidents connected with them would remind her about famous people she knew. The sparkling and never-ending stream of her talk rolled on. When a student was late to a recitation, he had only to say to the professor, "I met Mrs. Boltwood on the street." And the professor would put up one hand in a gesture of understanding and exclaim, "Say no more, you are excused." Her nimble wit was ever ready. And the author of this story goes on to say that Fanny kept scrapbooks, one on religious doctrine, one on science, one on biographies of people. And her collections and the depth of her reading was able to fuel all of these conversations and enable her to speak on a wide variety of topics. Fanny was born in Little Compton. And of course, her parents were the Reverend Shepard, May Shepard, and Deborah Haskins Shepard. She would have been educated in Little Compton, perhaps in our one-room school system, more likely at home by her parents. And her parents would send her to Boston to her grandparent Haskins' house for further education, for the refinement of living in Boston. And in Boston, she would play with her cousin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, because Deborah Shepard's sister Elizabeth had married the Reverend William Emerson, and they too were the fathers of Ralph Waldo Emerson. So again, very elevated, very educated family. And here is a portion of the family album sent to us by a digital photograph sent to us by Cam Oborn. And it shows Ruth Emerson, a portrait of Ruth, a photograph of Ralph Waldo Emerson right next to his cousin, Fanny Haskins Shepard. Lucius was an attorney. We know he worked in the Dickinson law firm. Social elite in Amherst, involved in all the charities, involved in the churches, very, very involved at Amherst College. He was on their board of directors for over 36 years, and he received their first honorary degree. And although there is a big difference in time between the photographs and the portrait, I think there's enough there that, we can be certain that this is the same person, and Lucius Boltwood really is the man in the portrait. So around the village green, Life in Amherst, Mary Adele Allen wrote about her tour with Mrs. Boltwood of the Boltwoods' home. You can see their beautiful home pictured in the illustration here. Now, I was reading this to try and learn about the Boltwoods, and much to my absolute delight, Mary Allen starts to talk about the rooms in the house and the furnishings in the house and the decorative arts in the house, just like it's a historic house tour. And she goes into detail about the portraits in the house, and she lists them all. And so these are the portraits that passed down through the Boltwood family, went to the Boltwood Williams house in Goshen, and it even talks about the portrait pair that our donor Linda inherited. So as a family, the Boltwoods owned a portrait of Mrs. Boltwood's mother, Deborah Haskins Shepard, with her 3 children by Otis Bullard in 1839. So somewhere out there, there is a portrait of Mace Shepard's wife, Deborah Shepard. It exists. Linda's aunt was correct. The family did own a portrait of this woman, but it's not the portrait that they donated to us. It is right now in storage near Goshen, waiting for a group of volunteers to create their house museum and have a safe place for the portrait to hang. And I am very, very eager to see that portrait because that would be of a woman who was very important in Little Compton during her lifetime. There are the portraits of her brother, Reverend George Shepard, with Sally Inman Kast. So that confirms that it's a husband and wife pair, with the wife being older than the husband. There are some silhouettes. And finally, there are portraits of Fanny and Lucius by Bullard. And absolute confirmation in my mind that the portraits we were given are the portraits of Fanny and Lucius Boltwood. These are the scrapbook pages that Cam sent us, all sorts of family photographs, a really wonderful, easy collection of the family. On this page, on the first page, it talks about the Haskins and 3 of their children, and it talks about 6 of Mace, Shepard, and Deborah's children. So at the bottom, with the silhouettes and the small photographs, you see 6 of the Shepard children pictured there. What is of great interest to me is that there is a caption for Deborah Haskins Shepard, and if in the upper left-hand corner, there's a portrait of a woman. Now that portrait is not labeled, but if you look at the whole page and you look at all the other labeled things, there's really only one person that it could be, and that's Deborah Haskins Shepard. And that portrait is sitting on top of a circle with a house in it. And I'm sure you can't, oh, thanks, Jenna. And I'm sure you can't read the label on that house, but it says built by the Reverend Mace Shepard, Little Compton, Rhode Island. So that is supposed to be a picture of the house that Mace built in Little Compton. That I wonder about, because I know the Congregational Church provided their ministers with a house. The ministers didn't have to build their own houses. That also looks to me like the house at the corner of the Commons and south of the Commons, which would have been the Meeting House Inn at one point. And as far as I know, that house was in the Wilbur family, built by Wilburs, lived in by Wilburs for years and years and years. But that's another topic for us to research another day and find out if that is accurate or not. But the portrait the portrait in the corner at the top interests me greatly as being a photograph of the portrait that is in storage, unable for us to see for the next few years, but maybe someday, and very likely what our minister's wife actually looked like. Now, because he died so early in 1821, and because Little Compton portraits are so rare, we're not lucky enough to have a portrait or a photograph of a portrait of Mace Shepard. But yesterday when I was doing some prep for this talk, I came across a description of Mace Shepard from another Little Compton minister, the Reverend Ray Palmer. And I've put a portrait here. I just want to be really clear. This is not a portrait of Mace Shepard. It's a portrait of his son, Charles. But when you hear the description that I'm going to read of the father, maybe you'll agree with me that there might be some resemblance between the father and the son. In his personal appearance, Mr. Shepard was imposing and in his last years venerable. He was about 6 feet in stature, well proportioned, strongly built, but not corpulent, stood perfectly erect, and always moved with an air of easy dignity. His head was rather large, but well developed in every part and rounded in its outline, the forehead naturally high, the effect of which was increased by baldness, and the features of the face regular and pleasing, with a light and fair complexion. The eyes were not large, but were animated and remarkably expressive of cheerfulness and good nature. And he goes on to say that Master Shepard always had a kind word for adults. He was gentle with children, and his manner of preaching was affectionate and winning, yet at times deeply impressive. The people over whom he was settled being plain in their tastes and habits, it was always his aim to address them in a simple and unpretending way. So we started with the promise of portraits of Mace Shepard and his wife, Deborah. That didn't come true. We did figure out that they were portraits of his daughter and her husband. And in the end, due to our research, we do get a glimpse of a portrait of Deborah that we may be able to see, may be able to borrow, or at least photograph sometime in the near future, and at least a description of our minister. So again, one of the really fun sort of Nancy Drew moments in my job, where we got to spend a whole week research, or 3 or 4 solid days researching, learning something new every day, changing our minds and our opinions about things every day as we learn more. And I think ultimately settling on good, solid identification for the folks who were painted in the portrait. So if anyone has any questions or comments, we'll be more than happy to try and answer them. Oh, I will say that I had read about Mace Shepard, learned a little bit about him while I was doing research on slavery and Black history in Little Compton, and was impressed that at his time, which was the early 1800s, he was actively taking steps in the community to make life better for its free residents of color. He did own an enslaved girl whose name was Philana, but he took Philana in front of the town council, proved that Philana was healthy, and when she was 18 years old would be able to take care of herself, and he arranged with the council for Philana to be free when she did become an adult. He also helped a free Black man, Fortune Gray, own a house in Little Compton, and he later sold land to Fortune's daughters, one of whom's name was Sabina and the other one I believe was Mariah, making them the first Black female landowners in Little Compton. So I think Mace Shepard left a good legacy in Little Compton, and I was happy to have this opportunity to trace, his family once they left Little Compton into their new lives in Amherst. So Jenna, are there any questions?
There is one comment. Isaac B. Richmond bought Mace Shepard's house at Southwood Commons. It was the small north L of Bill's house. Shepard was Isaac's tutor until he was sent to apprentice in Providence. Isaac designed and built the 3-story block on the south.
So I'm assuming that this is Helen,
Yes.
who is sharing this information, which is super. And so Helen, let's go back and look at that picture and see if it's the Richmond house and not the Meeting House Inn, because that would make sense.
Without question.
It's very clear to me.
Very without question.
If you look at pictures of
Bill's house or of that house now. It's very clearly the same house.
Okay, great. So that's, you solved the mystery. We didn't even have to research it.
Yeah, because Isaac, like as I wrote in the note, Isaac was tutored by Mays Shepard until his father died, and then he was sent to apprentice to the architect in Providence. But when he came back, he ended up buying the little north section. The big section, the big southern part, was designed and built by Isaac for his family when they came back from Savannah.
Okay, so that's great. So the label on this
Is
photograph,
right, but not right.
it's technically true, but it's really just the northern, very simple
It's
L.
yes.
The addition, not the addition because it was there first. So the very
Right.
simple original northern part of the house is where the Shepards lived with their 9 children, which
Right, and there's a portion, and I don't know what, there was a portion that was added and subtracted at the north end too, and I don't know, I'm not sure we know exactly what came and went in Shepard's period then, but we know it was changed around in the Richmond phase of things.
okay. That is fascinating. Thank you very much for
A
sharing that with
sidecar,
us.
but interesting too.
Oh, it's really
Linda?
interesting.
Sorry, Linda is on, and I believe she had a
Oh, great.
question. And she had unmuted herself.
Hi, Linda.
did you-
I'm okay. Just thank you for doing that.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you for donating.
You're welcome. I also have a silhouette of Seth Cherry.
Seth Terry, and remind me or tell me how he connects to the Little Compton folks.
Oh, I'd have to research it, but you've got just a head silhouette of him, and I have a full body silhouette. So we can discuss that and research it a little later. But I noticed that there was a silhouette, probably from the Williams Boltwood house in Cam, just a silhouette of his head.
Let's see. So on this page,
right here, I see it. Oh,
circle it.
yep. Oh, you disappeared it. So he's right here.
Okay, so Seth Terry, so he married one of the Shepard, or Hannah Shepard
Hannah
married
Shepard.
him. Okay, terrific. There was a silhouettist in the Providence area with a French name, and I want to say Edouard, but I can't recall if Edouard is a first name or a last name, who was very popular. And did some rather elaborate silhouettes, and we have one of them in the collection. Now, I assume if one person is doing silhouettes at a certain time, other people are doing it as well. So hard to say who these would all be attributed to. But it was a popular form of portraiture for folks who weren't going to have real painting portraits done, 20 or 30 years before photography became accessible to folks. So this is these early decades of the 19th century. We see silhouettes as a way of capturing someone's image, much less expensive than a portrait, and in advance of photographs, and sort of fell out of fashion once photographs became more readily available.
But can you go back to the initial view of the portraits themselves? Someone asked,
Sure.
because they are hard to see, if you can just describe what's happening in the background. To me, it looks like it's curtains.
I don't think there's much going on. I think it's a stylized curtain. And if we look at the two men's, it's, curtains sort of, well, Edward looks like he might have a column wrapped in a curtain. Lucius is more of a curtain, just kind of coming down on the left-hand side of the portrait. And then the women's portraits, the curtains are on the opposite side, the right-hand side, which helps them look more like a set.
Mm.
And the portraits of the photographs of the Dickinson portraits are really beautiful quality and show up really nicely. The portraits, the photographs that I'm using of the Boltwoods, I took on my cell phone. They're not great quality. And one of the things we will be doing soon is we'll probably ask one of our board members who takes wonderful photographs to come in, take some really high quality photographs of them. So when we put them in the online collection or when we talk about them in the future, we'll be able to use much more pleasing images of these beautiful portraits. Anything else, Jenna?
Not that I see now, no.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We're going to wrap up the presentation. If anyone has any parting questions, please type them into chat. Jenna and I will continue to check chat for a few minutes just to make sure we get everyone covered. And this talk is being recorded, and Jenna will pop it up on YouTube, and people will be able to see it in the future very easily. If they missed it this evening, you can spread the word.
And if you go to littlecompton.org, you can register for our other programs in the series. The next one is about doing genealogy from home, because especially with ongoing pandemic conditions, it can be hard to get into research locations. So how can you best leverage those tools to learn the most that you can? And that is mid-February.
Yeah, and that speaker, Marion, actually has an Adamsville connection. She's related to the Reverend Beverly Edwards, and she's a fabulous speaker and a real expert in the field. So if you're at all interested in genealogy, I would sign on to her program. And she also is quite knowledgeable about DNA as a research tool, and might be able to answer some of your questions there as well. Jenna, do you want to tell people about the History Club for adults before we sign off?
Sure. The last Friday of the month, we're going to be launching a History Club aimed at adults. So we have one that's aimed at middle school students. This is going to be, targeted for adults doing, kind of higher level things that can really contribute to our work at the Historical Society. So if you are interested at all, like I said, it's the last Friday, 3:45 to 5, and you can send an email to me at programs@littlecompton.org to let me know that you're interested.
In parting, I'll share one little tiny bit of information about Lucius that I just found adorable. When they were writing about him in the book about Amherst, they said he always wore a ruffled shirt, even though it was out of fashion. So in his portrait, you can see he has ruffles on, and then in each of his photographs, he's always wearing a ruffled shirt. And I just thought that was very dear. And sometimes it's those tiny little details that help you figure out who someone is in a photograph or in a portrait. And that was an especially sweet little detail in this study. All right. Good night, everyone. Stay well, stay healthy. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next program in February. Good night.